After all of this happened in the US, and then we got much better networking here,
Yeah.
other countries had picked up my software. I just found out that several other countries had used my software to connect to the internet back in the 90s.
Welcome, everyone, to the TechGuide podcast, where we give actual advice to those wanting to break into tech or are looking for their next gig. We have Professor Douglas Comer on the podcast today. Professor Comer has an amazing background, being a professor for 48 years at Purdue. He has multiple books out. He's done amazing stuff and is a great thought leader when it comes to computer science. So super excited for this episode. Thank you so much for being here, Professor Comer.
Oh, thank you for inviting me.
It's going to be great. I kind of alluded to some of your accomplishments right there in the intro, but I want to give you the floor and give the audience a little bit of groundwork for who Professor Douglas Comer is. Can you give a little bit of background of like what you teach at Purdue and some of the other accomplishments you've had in your career?
Well, it's been a long career, and I have wandered all over computer science. I started in theory. I wrote a book on operating systems. I wrote an operating system. Then I did some compiler work and taught compilers. I have done a bunch of things, but the things I'm most well known for are operating systems. And I worked on the Internet project back when no one had heard the term Internet. And I wrote the book on TCP/IP. They're the Internet protocols. And it became the best-selling book in science and engineering.
Wow.
At one point, it was, everybody around the world wanted it, not just students. So just to be clear, most of the people buying it were engineers who were building internet projects, implementing internet at a company. So it was really very broadly accepted.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to talk about like building the internet. Take us to this time frame of like, the internet right now is so intuitive. Like, oh, how did you not have the internet 30 years ago? But it was true. Like, you didn't have the internet. So let's talk about like building the internet and like kind of like what you did there. I think that's a great place to start.
In the 1960s, people had started doing research on data networking, connecting computers. Now, in those days, it was all mainframes. Mm-hmm. And then along came this idea of doing packets. There were a couple of different people that had come up with the idea of using packet switching instead of circuit switching, which the telephone company had done all of the networking in the world with circuit switched systems. Then by the 1970s, Xerox PARC, Metcalfe and Boggs at Xerox PARC had built Ethernet. Hmm. There were experiments with token ring networks. There were all sorts of little data networks. Should it be big? Should it be small? And a couple of people wrote a paper, then Cerf and Kahn wrote a paper saying, we think we can connect together multiple disparate networks. Unlike the phone company, who had built one giant network that was always the same everywhere, they said, sometimes we need local networks, sometimes we need long-distance networks.
Yeah.
Let's see if we can connect them together into a functioning system. That was the idea for the internet. Literally, internetworking means connecting multiple networks together. So they worked on it. Vince Cerf led most of the project at DARPA, and I was invited to participate. Now, you have to understand, in those days, it was all brand new.
Yeah.
There weren't many computers. They were all big computers. So no personal computers, no cell phones, none of that stuff. And it's really hard for people now to even imagine that world where, even in computer science, if I wanted to send a program to one of my friends, one of my colleagues, I'd have to put it on tape. And there were actual little mailer boxes. Get this tape, stick it in a box, put the label on it, and send it through the postal system.
That's crazy.
It was a horrible situation, but nobody realized it. So we started working on the internet. There were people who did a lot of the protocol work. I was working on how to send IP over X25. That was the phone company's system for data networking. Some banks had been using it.
Yeah.
It was, well, I don't want to say anything now because, back in the day it was okay, but it was terribly designed, really.
Yeah.
Now, given what we know now, it wasn't a good design, but I figured out how to put IP over it, which meant we could go between two sites. We were particularly was working on the CSNet project that NSF and DARPA were supporting, and we were trying to figure out how to connect universities. We didn't have enough money to actually run wires between universities in different states.
Yeah.
So use the phone company X25 network to send packets across that. It was a circuit-based network, but we could send packets across it, and we could get them to another university, and we could have two universities speaking the internet protocols, even though there wasn't really an internet yet.
It's super interesting. I think it's interesting. The development of the internet is a fascinating topic. And what time frame was this around? Excuse me if I missed that. Yeah, but what time frame is this around? Just to give people an idea.
Well, I started in the late 1970s.
Okay, and
we had a system up and running by late 82. And we had universities communicating over my stuff. Later on, I found out, in fact, just a couple of years ago, I found out that after all of this happened in the US and then we got much better networking here.
Yeah.
Other countries had picked up my software. I just found out that several other countries had used my software to connect to the internet back in the 90s.
That's crazy. That has to be an impactful thing to think about, actually, is you were a founder of the internet.
I was there. There were lots of people who were working on it.
Yeah. So I want to take that and then talk about now to becoming a professor at Purdue University. You've been there for about 42 years. Obviously, you've done a lot of stuff in between, and you're overseeing a bunch of the computer science. Can you talk about some of the programs you've led at Purdue or courses?
Well, let's see. You have to go back in history.
Yeah.
1970s, computer science was a relatively new field. The earliest computer science departments started in the 60s, and Purdue was very proud that it had one of the first graduates from a computer science program in the late 60s. That was so great. So I got there in 76, and you can see that it wasn't much changed. Almost everybody who was a professor in computer science in those days had a PhD in mathematics. At other universities, some of them were from EE. So we had two sort of fields feeding into computer science, the EE people building computers and the mathematicians figuring out how to compute. What do you want to compute? What are computable functions? So I got to Purdue and I said, it's time to make some changes. We ought to be teaching courses that are more systems oriented. Now, I didn't realize it, but there were other people in other universities sort of thinking the same thing. So I revised all of the courses and taught a bunch of new courses that were very systems oriented. Instead of proving theorems, students learned to actually build things. How do you build an operating system? How do you build a compiler? So I did those courses, and it was, it was hard for me to see. It's really hard to understand now, but remember, there was no internet. So you didn't have easy communication with others. You had to go to conferences and you might meet somebody, but it wasn't as if you could easily just, go to your computer and read a whole bunch of stuff. So other people at other places were working on the same idea. Let's have real systems building in CS. For the mathematicians, of course, it was a giant change, and you can imagine they didn't like it. I convinced my second year here at Purdue, I convinced the dean that the computer science department actually ought to have a computer. We didn't have a computer. There was a mainframe on campus.
Crazy.
And faculty members in CS said, we don't need a computer. Well, I think about how many research assistants we could hire, how many teaching assistants we could hire, and we don't need a computer. How can you prove a theorem with computers?
That's insane.
I know, it's hard to. So imagine in that world now you're doing the internet, These guys had never even used a computer, really.
Yep.
When I was in grad school, one of the professors bragged, I've never actually used a computer. They were mathematicians. And so along came a whole bunch of other people doing the same thing in the 1980s. Computer science moved much towards systems. The internet changed everything. Suddenly now you could communicate with everyone else. And so now where do we go from here? Well, then for the next 20 years, it was everyone discovering that they could do distributed computing in their field. We had people like physicists saying, we can send data over networks. We can do an experiment in one location and get the results in another. So in computer science, lots of people, the database people, databases used to be on a single computer. And suddenly the database people were just enamored with, let's have distributed databases. Why don't we go to think about a corporation. It's got a database. Instead of putting the database on one computer, why don't we have 7 copies in 7 different buildings? And everybody gets access to their database and they can do the local stuff locally. And then that one can contact the other ones. And we can build distributed databases. So that was a big change. Then in the late 90s, something fundamental. Oh, I guess I should say that along with the distributed system stuff, the advent of personal computers and cheap workstations, and suddenly it was inexpensive to have 10 computers instead of one giant computer. So then in the late 90s, the distributed systems era ended. It ended because we ran out of power building faster and faster processors. They were overheating. You couldn't cool them fast enough. It was you were cramming more and more transistors on every chip, and we hit the power wall. So the double E's said, we can't make the clock speed go faster. You're going to have to think about what to do. And out of all of that came cloud computing. Interesting. The idea that we would have many small computers all connected together in a network, in a data center. And instead of having one giant fast supercomputer, you use many small ones. In the early 2000s, people started asking, okay, suppose we have a data center. How can I divide up my work among many small computers, whatever the work is, whether it's, linear algebra for scientific computing, or whether it's, web stuff. How can you have a web server that spans many computers? Because up until then, everything was always one computer at a time.
Yeah.
So we've been working on that. And all along this path, I've written books. I wrote a book on cloud computing. Here's what you need to know about cloud computing. And so what can I say? Computer science keeps changing. Of course, what the hot topic is now.
Oh, yeah.
It's all AI. Everybody is asking, how will AI affect what I do? I just talked to an engineer in Silicon Valley, and she's doing AI. She was doing networking a couple of years ago, the last time I talked, and now it's AI. Of course, you have to do, follow the trends.
Yeah. And is that advice that you would give to a current, junior or senior that's in college? Would you recommend them going to AI right after school to follow the trend? Or do you think that there's other opportunities? Obviously, there's other opportunities, but would you recommend someone basically after school to look into going to AI to hop on the trend as well?
All right. So there are lots of things happening. AI is still in the hype phase.
For sure.
And the real question for someone coming out is, what can I do that will have long-term value? Yeah, if you can come out right now and say, oh, I took a course on AI. That's a tick mark on a resume, and you may have a higher probability of getting hired. But I've also talked to people, most of the time it's in Silicon Valley. When I talk to people, they're mostly from tech companies, who are, let's say, disenchanted with all of the AI hype, one company had hired data scientists. They're the people doing analysis of data and AI, and then they were very unhappy with what happened. Everybody was doing data science for a while.
Yep.
And they're very unhappy. And those people are now, I guess they're on a bubble. They're, are they going to keep their job or not?
Yep.
So my advice to young people is get as solid background as you can. Don't bet on the latest hype. Get a really solid, broad background. That way, if the bubble bursts, you can adapt.
Yep.
But if you put all your eggs in one basket, you won't be able to do it. The other thing I'll say is, in the engineering world, in the tech world, you really need to have basic skills. And the basic skill that you really need, number one, is problem solving. It's not, did you memorize everything about this latest programming language? Did you memorize everything about this latest architecture? Did you learn all of the AI techniques that were being used today? How do you solve problems? And I mean in a broad sense. I just had a student come to me and say, my program isn't working. Well, what do you mean? Would you just look at the code and tell me what's wrong? No, I want you to figure out. You have to learn how to solve the problem. And the beauty of computers is you can put in data and see what's going on. Mm-hmm. You can actually figure it out. It's unlike, when I was in school, I always disliked the social sciences where you had to write an essay and you had to sort of guess what the professor was looking for.
Yeah.
Didn't know, and you couldn't figure it out. But when it's in science, math, in computer science, you can figure it out. That's the beauty of it. You can do a little experiment. Okay, my program's not working. Try it on one input. Try it on a bunch of inputs. Try it on small numbers. Try it on, whatever it is what the program does. Take a look and then put in debug code. Figure out what steps are working and what steps are not.
I love that. That's really good advice. I want to ask, I love the problem solving part. I feel like a lot of students right after school, I'm only 25, so I'm not saying my problem skills are good, but exponentially better since I graduated. And that's like really a muscle you need to train and grow, especially early in your career. But you said a part about building a solid background, one that could be bubble proof, if you want to say. What does like building that background look like? What are some of those skills that you need to do to develop like kind of a full background?
Well, first rule, I tell undergrads, especially undergrads, you're not in school to get a degree. You're in school to build a career, and you better think about every course you take, because 10, 20 years from now, maybe you'll be sitting at a desk doing something and you'll think, oh, I remember there was something in a course. I wish I had learned it.
Yeah.
So take it very seriously. It's not a matter to do the minimum to get whatever grade. In fact, grade inflation is terrible these days. Almost everybody gets A's. So getting an A doesn't do much.
Mm.
What you need to say to yourself is, I want to learn much more than this course teaches. I'm building a career. I want to know all the ins and outs. If you get a chance to talk to a professor one-on-one, don't just say, hey, how can I get an extra credit point here? Ask him, what's the most important part of the subject you're teaching? What should if I wanted to go on in this area and build a career in this, what part of it would be really important to learn?
That's great advice.
So it's that business of thinking, I'm building a career and I need to know everything. When I was in grad school, I used to talk to my fellow grad students. They were saying, oh, this course is boring. I don't think we'll ever need this. This course is a math course. Now, remember, I was doing it in a day when most of the professors had mathematics as their basis. I'll never need this. And I said to them, wait a minute, how do you know? maybe there'll be some problem that you need to understand the mathematical basis. I'll give you an example.
Please.
Before I went to grad school, I was asked to write a computer program that would check student programs. And the problem was they were trying to read too many inputs. In fact, it was all cards in those days, punch cards, and they would read too many cards. And I was asked, can you write a program that just checks the student's program? Is it going to read too many cards? Well, it turns out that that problem is mathematically impossible to solve. Not just hard, not just you didn't think about everything. It's mathematically impossible. So if you know the mathematics and somebody asks you to do that program, say to yourself, I can't do that. No one can. That's mathematically impossible. There are lots of things like that in math that border on computer science.
Yep.
So, I always tell students, don't think it's just a boring course that you'll never use. You never know.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of that as well. Like you never do know, but it's also like approaching a problem, something where it's like I'll never use this, but it's still like taking the repetition to like figure it out. And like that's building a separate muscle that like maybe, sure, you might never use this problem again, but like the fact that you're trying super hard, putting in consistently, trying to figure it out, that it's actually building a separate muscle that you will use when building your career.
So let me tell you, right, these days in mathematics and in computer science both, students seem to have the notion that, well, all the problems that they're asking me to solve have been done and they're on the internet. All I really need to do is download the answer.
Yeah.
Why should I? And I always tell the students, look, what you're doing here is like going to a gym and building muscles. It's not that you want to be able to lift, the barbell. You'll never do that. Who cares? But you may need a muscle to lift other things. And that's what you're doing when you take computer courses. Yeah, everything you do, you can find on the web. And these days, it's hard to write a problem that students can't just download the answer. But it's self-defeating. If you just go to the web and download the answer, even if you get it right, it doesn't help you learn how to do it. And B, I'll tell you, there are 1,000 wrong answers out there for everything. It's incredibly bad. I know, especially in computing where you can download parts of a program. I need to look something up in an array. Okay, I've got some code that found on the web. Here's lookup in an array. I also need to, correlate that with something else. Here's a little thing that correlates two things. And you put them together and they don't work. Part of it was from program A. They made assumptions about the input. They made assumptions about the data. And part of it was program B, different assumptions. And you look at it, and anybody who's actually written programs can say, these don't belong together. Last year, I had a student who walked in and put code on my desk. He said, I know all this code is right. It was downloaded from the web, and he had mixed together two different APIs. And I told him, you can't do that. It's so obvious to me. Why isn't this obvious to you? Because he hadn't learned what the APIs really were. He thought, instead of learning what these things are all about, I'll skip that part and just download the answer. Yeah, just take it seriously. You're building a career, not getting a degree.
I love that. That is really, really good advice. Building a career, not getting a degree. I want to ask, as we kind of do have limited time here, I want to ask, like, how can someone that's a senior that's graduating this upcoming spring, whatever, how can they stand out early in their career? Like, what advice would you give to someone that's like, Professor Kahmer, I want to stand out early on in my first job. What advice do you have for me?
Okay, so here's the advice that students don't like to hear. What I tell them is, while you're in school, build projects on your own. They don't have to be giant projects.
That's great advice.
But don't just do what everybody does in a class. Ask yourself, how can I build, in my case, it's in computer science, build a computer program that would help me somehow? What do I do every day? Maybe I could write a program that helped me do my calendar. Or maybe I could write a program that helps some fraternity or sorority do their fundraiser or
great advice.
Whatever it is. It doesn't have to be fantastic. Do it all yourself. Start with what are the requirements? Figure out how to represent the data. What's the output that I want to get? How do I want to display this? What's the level of the people using the program? You ask all those questions, and then you write the software and try it out. If you do it all yourself, when you get out, you will find that you have a skill that 90% of the others don't have.
Yeah.
Because if you just follow what the professor says, here, write this program, here's the input, here's the output, and here are the steps you should take. Yeah, you've learned how to implement things, but you haven't learned how to think about them.
Yeah, that's great advice. And I remember, so I started podcasting actually my senior year of college. That's when I started like my first podcast just on the side. And I was applying for like sales and marketing roles after school, and employers ate that up. They're like, oh my God, you started your own thing, like in college, like a podcast, like that's great networking type of thing. And it really like made me stand out compared to others.
So,
and I think that advice is great.
Yeah, in terms of interviewing, that is a big plus. If you can say, I did this project all on my own. I thought it up, I implemented it, I got people to use it. That's a huge plus. In fact, I have talked to interviewers in Silicon Valley. One of them told me, my only question, I look at the resume and I do chit chat. The only question I care about is, tell me about some little project you did on your own. And it doesn't even have to be an engineering project. What did you do? People who, in high school, for example, did some little project to lead a group, or if they did a project all on their own, they stand out.
Yeah, that's like some of the best advice I give to college seniors that ask me for advice is just, you got to make something on your own and it'll make you stand out. Like I can very much recall standing out because of that. Two more questions for you. Just advice you have for someone that is a junior, senior, for job searching advice. Like, what would you give to them as they begin their job search?
Job searching, number one on the list, get an internship. Most hires in tech field these days come from interns.
Mm-hmm.
So if you wait until you're a senior and then you go to the job fair and stick your resume in, low probability that you're going to get called at all. So when you're a junior, actually, you should be working to get an internship and take any internship you can get. A student came to me and said, I wanted to work on AWS Cloud. It's the best. And I didn't get an internship there, so I just told the rest of them, nah. And that's a terrible attitude. Take any internship, because if you get an internship, that's a foot in the door. May not be the company you want to go to. In fact, in computing, what's really shocking to many students is that some of the people that want to hire them are not tech firms. So, did you know that John Deere, the tractor guys, do you know that they have their own cloud, that they have self-driving tractors, that they hire lots of technical people? But students look at that and say, an agricultural firm.
Yeah.
So the other thing is, take any internship and don't be picky about the type of job, the type of industry.
Yep.
You never know. Years ago, I was doing consulting for the printing industry back in the days of hot lead. And some of the students said, why would you go talk to people that do printing? Oh, I was talking to the people who printed, in those days, the Sears catalog.
Yeah.
It was all manual stuff. You can't imagine. It was manual typesetting with putting the little lead things into a big tray and then putting them on the press.
Yep.
But they were looking ahead to electronic typesetting. And behind the scenes, all that was going on
It's it's fun. And you know, what's so funny is I know two people that went to Purdue, and one of them actually works for John Deere, and I'm not even kidding when I say that. So that's why I was laughing when you said that. So yeah, it goes to show that there's a lot of ways to break into an industry. But very last question for you. If someone's like, oh my gosh, this is an amazing episode, I need more advice, how can people connect with you and learn a little bit more about you?
Oh, I'm easily visible on the web. You can look me up. Somebody created a Wikipedia page for me.
I saw that.
I'm in the Internet Hall of Fame, and you can reach me as comer@purdue.edu.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Comer, for coming on today. Love the insights. Some great advice in here. Very sound advice. So everyone, please reach out to Professor Comer. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.